The Vanishing of the Sodder Children. It was a quiet Christmas Eve in 1945, the year after World War II ended. The world was beginning to rebuild, and in the small coal mining town of Fayetteville, West Virginia, the Sodder family was preparing for the holiday. George and Jenny Sodder, Italian immigrants, had built a life for themselves and their 10 children in the rolling hills of Appalachia. Their home, a 2-story timber house, stood as a symbol of everything they had worked for. That night, 9 of their children were asleep. The oldest son was away in the military, and the others were nestled in their beds, excited for Christmas morning. But for 5 of the Sodder children, Maurice, Martha, Louis, Jenny, and Betty, Christmas would never come. At approximately 1 a.m., a fire broke out in the Sodder home. It spread with a speed and intensity that seemed impossible, quickly consuming the house. George and Jenny, awakened by the smoke, rushed to save their family. They managed to get 4 of their children out, 3 boys and 1 girl, but the 5 youngest children who had been sleeping upstairs were nowhere to be found. The flames were too fierce for George to reach them. Desperate, George tried everything. He raced outside to grab a ladder, only to find that the ladder he always kept near the house was missing. Panicking, he tried to start his truck to drive it under the window and climb up to the 2nd floor, but mysteriously, both of his trucks, which had been working fine earlier that day, wouldn't start. Meanwhile, Jenny ran to a neighbor's house to call for help, but the phone lines were dead. It was as if, on that freezing December night, everything was working against them. In just 45 minutes, the Sodder home was nothing more than a pile of ash. The fire had consumed everything. And yet, when the fire chief and investigators sifted through the wreckage the next day, they found something truly inexplicable: no human remains. Not a single bone, no charred fragments, nothing to suggest that 5 children had perished in the blaze. How could this be? Local authorities concluded that the children must have died in the fire, claiming that the flames had been so hot that they burned their bodies completely. But the Sodders weren't convinced. George and Jenny were grief-stricken but also deeply suspicious. If the fire had been so intense, why hadn't it burned everything else to the ground? They found remnants of household appliances, metal bed springs, and other debris. And yet, not one trace of their 5 children's bodies was found. But that wasn't the only thing that didn't add up. Strange occurrences had started long before the fire. In the months leading up to Christmas, a mysterious man had visited George, asking about his views on Mussolini, the Italian dictator. George, a proud and vocal opponent of Mussolini, had made enemies in the local Italian-American community. The man ominously warned George that his house would go up in smoke, and his children would pay the price for his beliefs. George didn't take the threat seriously at the time, but now, he couldn't shake the feeling that it was connected to the fire. On the night of the blaze, more odd things happened. Earlier that evening, Jenny had answered a bizarre phone call from a woman whose voice she didn't recognize. The woman laughed inappropriately, asking for someone Jenny had never heard of. And then there was the ladder. It had always been kept propped against the side of the house, but that night it had vanished, only to be found later at the bottom of a nearby embankment. And then there was the phone line. Why had it been cut? Investigators initially dismissed it as a result of the fire, but later, they determined that it had been deliberately severed before the flames even started. As the days turned into weeks, and the weeks into months, the Sodders' grief turned to determination. Something wasn't right. They refused to believe that their children had died in the fire. Could they have been kidnapped instead? And if so, why? Theories started to swirl. One witness, a bus driver, claimed to have seen the children looking out of a car window as it passed the burning Sodder house that night. Another woman said she had seen the children at a hotel with 2 strange men, though nothing ever came of these leads. And then, in 1949, George Sodder took matters into his own hands. He hired a pathologist to dig through the remains of the house. During this excavation, they found bones, but not the bones of the Sodder children. They were determined to belong to someone much older, leading investigators to wonder, who were these bones from, and how did they get there? As the years went on, the mystery deepened. In 1952, George and Jenny put up a billboard along Route 16, just a few miles from their home, displaying photographs of their missing children and offering a $5,000 reward for information. They even hired private investigators to search for leads, but nothing ever came of it. In 1968, over 2 decades after the fire, Jenny received a photo in the mail. It was of a young man, around 30 years old, who looked strikingly similar to her son Louis, who would have been in his 20s by then. On the back of the photo were the cryptic words, "Louis Sodder, I love brother Frankie, little boys." Who sent the photo? Was it a cruel joke, or was it a clue from someone who knew where the children had been taken? For the rest of their lives, George and Jenny Sodder never stopped searching for answers. They both died without ever knowing what really happened to their 5 children. To this day, the fate of the Sodder children remains an unsolved mystery. Was it an accident or a carefully orchestrated kidnapping? Who were the people involved, and why target the Sodders? And what happened to Maurice, Martha, Louis, Jenny, and Betty on that fateful Christmas Eve? Nearly 80 years later, the story still haunts the quiet town of Fayetteville. The Sodder children's disappearance remains one of the most perplexing cold cases in American history, a chilling enigma that continues to captivate and disturb those who hear it.